Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Eric Ponder. I am the African Studies Librarian at Michigan State University Libraries. On behalf of the Ubuntu Dialogues team, I would like to thank you for making time to join us for Ubuntu Dialogues web seminar. As I am sure most of you already know, the Ubuntu Dialogues is a partnership project between the Michigan State University African Studies Center and Stellenbosch University Museum that is funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. The partnership is imagined around Ubuntu, an African sociocentric philosophy premised on collective humanity and interdependence. It comprises three key components: virtual student conversations, an internship program, and a seminar exchange program. The virtual student conversations bring together Stellenbosch and MSU students from historically marginalized and underrepresented minority backgrounds to discuss critical issues facing young people in today's world. The student internship program places Stellenbosch University and MSU students in cultural heritage institutions in the US and in South Africa, where they will gain valuable global community engaged learning experiences. The seminar exchange program, which we are all here for, takes the form of transnational intellectual engagements among scholars and practitioners. The focus of the seminar exchange program is on institutional of Pan-Africanism, knowledge, and institutional decolonialization and transformation, both as concepts and practice. Following the suspension of international travel in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, the format of the seminar changed from in-person to virtual. Today's webinar is the fifth in a series of virtual seminars that started in September 2020. I would like to introduce today's presenter, Angela Tate. Angela Tate is a PhD student in history at Northwestern University, located in Evanston, Illinois, USA. Her dissertation focuses on the intersection of race, gender, popular culture, and the Pan-African politics of the 20th century. The title of Ms. Tate's paper is When Glamour Was African, Etta Moten Barnette and Race, Gender, and Celebrity in the Black Freedom Struggle, 1945 to 1970. In the 1950s, African-American singer and actress Etta Moten brought together the worlds of Africa and the Americas through her radio program, I Remember When. Technology seems irrelevant to Pan-Africanism, but radio, print, film, and television melded with the age-old technologies of oration and performance in the era of decolonialization and civil rights. Tate's research looks at women across the African diaspora who engage with these to express their solidarity with the global Black freedom struggle, display their role as activists, and make visible the invisible voices, primarily those of women, in a cacophony of international relations and for today's discussion, Uhuru Phalafala. Uhuru Phalafala, PhD from the University of Cape Town, is a lecturer in the Department of English at Stellenbosch University. She is an archivist of Black cultural production and a jazz record collector. Anti-apartheid and anti-colonial movements, Cold War era cultural circuities, and Black internationalism. She is currently completing her book project on Black radical traditions from the South. So today's presenter will present for about 30 minutes. The discussant will be up to 10 minutes, and then we will entertain questions. Please put your questions in the Q&A box to post your questions and comments. Thank you. Angela.
Thank you for that wonderful welcome, Eric, and nice to meet you, Uhuru, and I look forward to our conversation. I will begin my presentation now and sharing my screen. So the turn of the 20th century was a moment when, quote, the figure of the female star consolidated as a recognizable and marketable category, end quote. I argue in this project that the rise of the Black female star as a, quote, recognizable and marketable category, end quote, not only influenced the currents of the long civil rights movement, but these women played a significant role in the transmission of topical images or issues such as actress and singer Etta Moten Barnette, who lived from 1901 to 2004, and her popular radio program in the 1950s through the 1960s, I Remember When, which brought up-to-date news of Ghana's independence, among other issues and events and activists, to audiences in the United States. Furthermore, despite brutal racism and oppression, this new celebrity culture allowed Black female stars a visibility denied to the average Black woman, though they were not exempt from discrimination. However, this visibility could often contradict the invisibility of anti-Black violence and create an oral memory of injustice that reached beyond personal testimonies, such as when Billie Holiday sang "Strange Fruit" against the continued threat of lynching and the illicit circulation of lynching postcards in the 1930s. By the 1940s and 1950s, Black women celebrities like Moton, Lena Horne, Katherine Denham, Josephine Baker, Hazel Scott, and more were both international celebrities and deeply embedded in the struggle against racial oppression and imperialism at home and abroad. The linchpin of my project is Etta Moten Barnette. Though she is relatively less known today than she was in her lifetime, Moten broke a number of barriers in the entertainment industry. For a brief period in the 1930s, she was one of the handful of Black actresses to star in major motion pictures. Later, she performed on Broadway as Bess in Gershwin's folk opera, Porgy and Bess, and toured most of the Western Hemisphere, singing a repertoire of spirituals and operas. By the 1940s, she was the soft power behind her husband Claude A. Barnett's official role, or unofficial role, as liaison between the United States and Africa and the Caribbean because of the connections made between the African diaspora with his newswire service, the Associated Negro Press, or ANP. The ANP serviced news, advertisements, and press releases to hundreds of Black newspapers in the United States, as well as more in Africa in both French and in English. The actress and the newspaper magnate made a formidable team, and Moten's interest in Africa and the diaspora through song, art, dance, and more paired well with the now open doors of the palaces of kings and the drawing rooms of diplomats in the post-war era. Between the 1930s and the 1980s, Moten traveled between the United States, Africa, the Caribbean, and Latin America, first as an actress and concert singer, and later as a member of Black women's organizations such as Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority and the Links Incorporated for international meetings hosted by the United Nations. Over the course of her life and career, Moten encountered and cultivated a wide network of Black women performers, artists, and activists who were deeply invested in domestic and international struggles. Popular perceptions of these Black women, some I've named, focus on their glamour, their fame and celebrity, and their careers on stage or in front of the camera, and completely miss their involvement in political movements and how entwined their careers were with their politics. Celebrity is viewed as frivolous, and famous women are viewed as even more frivolous, even as, over the course of the 20th century, their positions placed pressure on them to represent the race, to be race women, as early 20th century activists would call those invested in fighting against racism and oppression. This is most evident in Moten's radio program, I Remember When, which broadcast from Chicago between the mid-1950s and the mid-1960s. I Remember When is both an archive of her career in activism, as well as a source for understanding Black women's diasporic politics in an era of decolonization and civil rights. Furthermore, the choice of subjects Moten chooses to interview reveals the wide networks of Black women performers, intellectuals, and activists in the 20th century, particularly in Haiti and the Bahamas and Jamaica and Ghana at this period. So my project follows the shape of I Remember When, and as well as my dissertation, to tell the story of Black women celebrities, how they contended with gendered and racialized stereotypes, how their political consciousness grew and emerged in their careers, and what it meant specifically for Black women and the wider networks formed by Black women celebrities in the global civil rights movement to be as deeply involved in fighting oppression and imperialism when they would be discriminated against for being Black as well as for being a woman. This project also focuses on the relationship between the stage or motion picture or radio or other entities of entertainment and respectability, and a relationship between Black women performers and civil rights activism through multiple sites that Etta Moten Barnette encountered throughout her lengthy career over the 20th century. I want to use these sites to analyze the work undertook while also dealing with sexism and racism and the intersection of activism and celebrity. I focus on Black women in these sites because of scholar Daphne Brooks's argument that it was two Black women performers who imagined the, quote, epic potential of performance to challenge the spatial, historical, and political limitations placed on African Americans, end quote. Though this project focuses on African American, Caribbean, and African women, I feel that Brooks's analysis is critical to all because Black women performers, feminist politics, and activism is always contested, either by people in their community who think they aren't respectable enough or that their image, personal life, and or career are too frivolous to do the serious work, and that serious is in scare quotes, or they are deeply contested by racist entertainment industry and society that turns against them when they use their platform grudgingly given to them in order to advocate for political issues. An additional burden that Black women performers faced was to walk the line of performing respectable, in scare quotes, gender and sexuality within their communities, even as they were used as symbols of progress and modernity during the global civil rights movement. Overall, Black dance, film, radio, art, newspaper, and theater histories have done the work of reclaiming the people, the prints, the performances, and the productions of these professions. Individual biographies have focused on the life and career of Black artists who were prominent in civil rights activism, such as Harry Belafonte or Lena Horne or Sammy Davis Jr. or other performers. But I also think that there is more to be said when you focus on Black women as a whole and thinking about the networks that they formed as opposed to reifying this myth of the great woman or the great man standing alone and everyone else is following them, which is why I'm so interested in Etimoton Barnette, because her relative obscurity today is because she was very much interested in making these connections and these networks and forming these solidarities as opposed to being the only one standing. So to push my argument further, when I look at Black women celebrities in Pan-Africanism and Black internationalism and civil rights movements, they're significant because you must grapple with their fame and their celebrity. So what role did their celebrity play in their activism and performance? What does it mean when they are forgotten? And how does celebrity shape their memory of them and their work? By focusing on these elements, I look at the global civil rights movement as more than just a political or an intellectual history. It is cultural. It is also part of a lifestyle, and it is a process of sisterhood. And the Black women performers and activists in my dissertation project embody this. The Black women performer as activists surprisingly has a lengthy history, as Gay Gibson Sema explores in performing anti-slavery and activist women on antebellum stages, such as in the early to mid 19th century. Throughout the antebellum period, Black and white women in the US and the United Kingdom blended the domestic sphere with the public sphere in anti-slavery activism, using the parlor, the church, the sewing circle as sites of performance where they, quote, staged activist dialogues and plays, read essays aloud, gave speeches, canvassed neighbors, telling anti-slavery stories door to door while gathering signatures on petitions, end quote. The importance of arts and culture in what is broadly conceived as the field of, quote, Black internationalism is not unknown once we move into the late 19th and into the early 20th century. And as we see, as I hope to show you, this use of the domestic sphere on these international stages, not just physically, but actually when they have their records shipped overseas or you see them on screen, is this broad continuum of how Black women performers are performing femininity and respectability while also being very prominent and being very visible. And so in Paul Gilroy's seminal text, The Black Atlantic, the basis of his argument is that race, culture, and modernity in this Black Atlantic, which is a geographic area created by the transatlantic slave trade on expressive cultures, Black music developed from anti-literacy laws and the multilingual early enslaved society, which challenges the, quote, privileged conceptions of both language and writing as preeminent expressions of human consciousness, end quote. Gilroy further incorporates the importance of performance to this development of a Black intellectual history when he characterizes the popularity of the Fisk Jubilee singers in the 1860s as a vital point of emergent intellectual diasporic consciousness built through their movement across the Atlantic and their connections with, quote, authentic Blackness, since they were equally as popular as minstrel Blackface performers at this same period. I situate this project in the field of Black internationalism because Black women performers like Moton, like Josephine Baker, Miriam Makeba, and more emerged on the global stage simultaneously with the linkage of Atlantic and Pacific world struggles against Jim Crow, racism, and colonialism. Historian Keisha N. Blaine categorizes the field as, quote, an insurgent political culture emerging in response to slavery, colonialism, and white imperialism that centers visions of freedom and liberation movements among African descended peoples worldwide, end quote. By situating this project into the more specific category of Black women's internationalism, I not only answer Blaine and scholar Tiffany M. Gill's call to find more complexity in this concept, that is, to move beyond foreign policy and even political struggle as the single defining characteristic, but center Negritude writer Jean Nardal's 1928 definition of Black internationalism. In an article entitled Internationalism Noir, Nardal directed attention to artists and performers as the key site to the emergence of this post-war diasporic consciousness, whereupon, quote, the cinema, the theater, the music hall opened their doors to the conquering Blacks, end quote. However, because most histories of Black internationalism only briefly touch on expressive cultures, my project hopes to bring Black internationalism and performance studies together with this insurgent political project, as Brent Hayes Edwards says in The Practice of Diaspora, which was published in 2003. Following Edwards, a number of scholars have contributed to the formation of this Black international world. However, unlike Edwards, these scholars have redirected the sites of Black internationalist geography towards multiple sites across the Atlantic world, and then also into the Pacific world, following Tiffany Ruby Patterson and Robin D.G. Kelly's argument to treat the African diaspora as a unit of analysis. Thus, I emphasize what they emphasize, that this historical construction of the African diaspora is a continual reinvention and doesn't just illuminate New World and Old World dichotomy, but expands into the Indian Ocean world, the Islamic world, and incorporates United States history not as an exceptional nation state and history, but as part of this broad diasporic community. And so when I look at Etimoton Barnette, her contribution to Black internationalism and performance studies allows me to think more critically about where these sites of diasporic consciousness and where this development of this insurgent political movement emerges in ways that you might not see or think about if you're only focused on nation state borders and nationality and being deeply invested in national histories. When I think about adding gender, I think about historians of Black women, such as Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, Darlene Clark Hine, Elsa Barkley Brown, et cetera, who regularly contest and contend with the hegemonic histories of American women and African Americans. And so when I think about moving towards integrating these fields and looking at Edama Burnnett's life, I aim to contribute a conversation to a more robust analysis of class, gender, and sexuality through performance and Pan-Africanism in this, though largely simple historiography of Black internationalism. So in March 1957, when Etta Moten Barnette sat down to record interviews with Ghanaian women, she is being a part of this continuum that I argue is more concerned with diasporic consciousness and connections and networks than nation state borders and nation building, particularly in this era of decolonization. So few African Americans had heard the voices of Africans on radio, other than stereotypes from Hollywood, and much less African women. So when Moten thought it was, quote, such good luck to record episodes of her radio program with the Ghanaian women who, quote, represent the masses of women of the party, the Convention People's Party, the party that is in control, end quote, suddenly the event that seemed distant to even the imaginings of African Americans, the transition of the Gold Coast colony to Ghana under Kwame Nkrumah, drew near. For listeners, Moten simultaneously archived the sounds of a triumphant Ghana and amplified the voices of African women who, she expresses in a second broadcast, African American women had assumed to be, quote, the backward ones, subservient to men in all case, end quote. Having previously recorded programs with women activists and artists in Haiti, Argentina, and Brazil, Moten used this radio journalism to emphasize the importance of the international scope of Black feminist activism during the height of this era. Furthermore, her program challenged the popular press coverage of Ghana's independence, which focused on Nkrumah and thousands of African, European, American statesmen, activists, politicians, royals, and spectators who poured into Accra to celebrate the birth of a new nation. Much was also made of the Duchess of Kent's speech, which was a proclamation from the throne and Queen Elizabeth II's personal message, as well as the subsequent proclamations of Ghanaian statesmen. Silence beneath this hum of excitement, the buzz of jets, and the sonorous speeches were the women responsible for the nation's independence, whom Moten forcefully defended, quote, if you hadn't heard the voice of the so-called illiterate market women, you will hear her. I remember when broadcast these voices, as well as those of middle-class Ghanaian women, as well as her colleagues at the Ghana Broadcast Corporation, such as Rose O'Dampton, to insert their presence in the emergence of what historian Kevin Gaines describes as, quote, not just a new Africa, but of a new world, fashioned in the image of Black modernity and freedom, end quote. Radio, journalism, and other media forms were not absent from this concept of Black modernity and freedom, but was new was the emergence of Black women's voices in these spheres. As yet, there is little documentation about Moten's creation and broadcasting of I Remember When, but further research shows that it was from about July 1955 to about halfway point in 1967. And further research is necessary to research the other broadcasts that Moten lent her voice to, as well as her television broadcasts. But they also provide a deeper look at what radio does to the field of Black internationalism, and also how Moten used the radio to contest even narratives of progress at this period that often would exclude Black women. When Moten's humble beginnings from Texas, as well as in Kansas, where she first attended Western University in the all-Black town of Condaro, as well as University of Kansas, that was her incubator for the beginnings of her career, as well as her emphasis on creating these networks and creating this sisterhood. She attended Western University, which historian Helen Walker Hill considers, quote, one of the few HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities in the West, and was the best Black musical training in the Midwest for almost 30 years during the 1900s through the 1930s. Moten joined this incredible cadre of Black musicians who would become famous in their own right and provide a wide network of Black women in the entertainment industry. It was one of them, Eva Jesse, who was the lady with the white hair, who opened the doors for Moten after she completed her degree at the University of Kansas. And the other lady in the fur coat is Nora Douglas Holt, who was a pioneering Black woman composer and gossip columnist. Moten describes her experience when she moved to New York as, quote, I went to New York where they were friends. If there was a theme song connected to the story, it would be gratitude. Gratitude for friends who would say the right thing at the right time to the right person. In this particular career, there has always been that friend. Her name is Eva Jesse. Eva Jesse was a person who was very important to the music field. She included creating the music to Porgy and Bess, and all the versions of Porgy and Bess were imprinted by Eva Jesse's musical compositions and her choir, end quote. Moton was subsequently cast in a number of Broadway shows, including the short-lived play Zombie in 1932, which was a play where Moton starred as a character named Josephine, and it was set in Haiti, which allowed Moton to use the French training that she had received at the University of Kansas as a classically trained singer and actress. The script doesn't exist, but already Moton's facility with performing in a diasporic feminist manner was evident in her casting in the lead role, and Haitian themes connected to the research of dancer anthropologist Catherine Dunham and novelist playwright anthropologist Zora Neale Hurston, whom Etta Moten Barnett knew very well. Though Dunham and Hurston were rivals over who was the preeminent Black woman scholar on Haiti and Caribbean cultural expressions, both women, as well as Moten, fostered a lengthy professional career dedicated to showcasing the heritage of the African diaspora through song, dance, rhythm, and word. When Moten relocated to Hollywood, she reprised her role as Josephine on the radio, which provides an interesting note for both the possibilities of Hollywood to showcase Black women's voices in comparison to broadcasting in other parts of the country. At the same time, Black women characters were more often likely to be voiced by white male actors who used stereotypical dialect and skits, further accentuating Moten's oral fluidity in this period is her brief motion picture career in the early 1930s, where she was hired by RKO to dub the singing voices of white actresses, and then it was also used in two mainstream films such as Gold Diggers of 1933 and Flying Down to Rio, which was also released in 1933. She was uncredited, but had very prominent singing positions or singing scenes in these movies, and prompted a lot of fan mail to arrive to say, who is this woman? Who is she? Where did she come from? And when she did appear on screen in these films, the excitement stoked by the Black press, such as she had already begun to have collaborations with Claude Barnett. And so a Black gossip columnist gushed over in a column for the Philadelphia Tribune over Moten's, quote, womanly bearing, fine personality, and splendid character, end quote, and saw that as the source of her success, as well as her, quote, fine background and superior training, end quote, which sets the stage for thinking about who was considered to be respectable and what made Etimoton Barnette and other Black actresses considered to be respectable when they were on screen, despite at this period acting and actresses still being seen as very strange in terms of gender and sexuality, and women being visible in ways that they were not supposed to be. But Moten's experience in these films, as well as portraying a Haitian woman on radio, and then also in Flying Down to Rio, portraying a Brazilian woman, reveals the formation of her feminist and her Pan-African politics, particularly when she was hired by RKO to tour Brazil and Argentina as the star of Flying Down to Rio when she was not in the United States. According to Moten, she, quote, had a feeling of being at home there. You learn why. They have the same sort of history as ours. That is the history of the American Negro, the American of African descent. They too are of African descent. They had been brought there by the Portuguese. They were emancipated a little after the American Negro was emancipated. And the only difference there was that they were emancipated, they became Brazilians. No hyphenation, just Brazilian. A little simplified take on Brazilian history, but it makes sense for this period and for someone who is still formulating their concept and their ideas and their knowledge of what it means to be part of the African diaspora. Undoubtedly, at the insistence of Claude Barnett, whom Etta Moten married in 1934, she produced a series of articles chronicling her time in South Africa. And in one of her first articles, she echoes her recollections 20 years later in I Remember When, by noting that the whites were disliked in Brazil, and waxed poetically over the variety of complexions from, quote, creamy tan to the shade of Bill Robinson, end quote. Bill Robinson, the tap dancer and actor, and as well as an activist in the 20th century. The American diplomatic corps were confused, she also noted, by the invitations she received to high society events, invitations that were not extended to white passing Latina actresses like Lupe Velez and Conchita Montenegro, which also talks about which also can show how moving outside the United States borders made Etta Moten Barnette realize that there were other ways of being Black, that Black was not bound by just the United States concept of what it meant to be a person of African descent. And so when her 6-week tour took her from Rio de Janeiro to Sao Paulo to Buenos Aires and back, she doesn't note the feeling of belonging in Argentina based on the shared history or complexion, but she notes a shared history based on musical, because jazz and spirituals were very popular. And the radio programs that she recorded in Latin America, they asked her to sing those songs as opposed to the songs she had prepared to sing in Spanish. And then Moten Barnette, when she reflects back on her time in Latin America, she thinks about her experience of being on these radio programs and realizing that there are so many diasporic connections through sound and performance, and that she realizes that there's something more to being of African descent, particularly in the New World, that is deeply invested in cultural expressions. And so when she retired from stage and screen in the early 1940s, she brought her diaspora collection, her consciousness, as well as her career as a celebrity, to her life as Claude Barnett's wife, when he started becoming involved in relationships between the United States and colonial governments in Africa, and then as we move towards independence with African governments. And so in this immediate post-war era in the late 1940s, Claude Barnett, as well as another of other Black leaders and entertainers, and found themselves engulfed in Cold War politics. Many scholars have chronicled the relationship between the United States government and Black culture, as well as how the State Department tended to use African American celebrities to, I guess, like, be propaganda for American democracy in the Cold War. But when you look deeper, there were a lot of other things going on beneath using the state as a vehicle to travel, to meet other people, to meet people on the continent, to connect and think about, well, I might be using the US state and the US state might be using me, but how can we still forge these connections in the late 1940s and the 1950s? And so Etta Moten Barnette during this period played an important role when she traveled frequently to the Caribbean and to Africa, and Liberia in particular, and Nigeria and Ghana in this mid-century period. And so the launch of I Remember When provided a perfect opportunity for Moten to combine her deep interest in the African diaspora with being involved with using the State Department as a vehicle for travel. So when she recorded this transition from the Gold Coast colony to the Pan-Africanist Ghana, she was there with firsthand broadcasts to share these celebrations with listeners in Chicago. Though the broadcast that is best known in her interview is with Martin Luther King, who was also on hand at the festivities, Moten's most vibrant programs were with Ghanaian women, whom she declared, as I said in the before, quote, "If it hadn't been for the women of the Gold Coast, I don't think the party would have won in the election," end quote. Ghanaian women were at the heart of the independence movement, with market women especially standing at the heart of CPP's mass support, quote, "transmitting the party's message through song, dance, and other popular and socially democratic means of communication," end quote. So when Moten saw that they were also using dance and performance and other forms of cultural expressions that might be seen as frivolous or seen as unserious political actions, she saw something more, which is why she focused on them, which is why I also argue her radio program is so deeply important to understanding this period as more than just state building and nation making. So Moten used her radio program to correct their erasure from the media coverage of the event by not only centering them, but marking out the class differences between the market women and the middle-class Ghanaian women, who themselves were also divided between those who had been to Europe and educated there, or those who had been educated in Ghana, in order to deeply delve into the complexity of what it meant to be a Ghanaian woman, as opposed to the generic, generalized visions that were projected by Western news sources and media to just create these blanket ideas of what quote Africa was like. So this careful inclusion of gender, race, and culture was also part of Moton's political consciousness. And she boldly broached the topic of class in many of her interviews, where she asked these middle-class Ghanaian women about their views of the market women and whether there would ever be any synergy between these two class spheres, and what that meant for the emerging nation of Ghana to need to contend with class and these differences. And so subsequent interviews that Etta Moten Barnette broadcast on I Remember When moved to the women in Moton's circle to reflect on the different experiences of being a Black woman or a woman of African descent in this period. And when she went to interview the women who worked for the Ghana Broadcasting Corporation, it was also another way of exposing and exploring that there were Ghanaian women doing similar things that African American women were doing on the radio or women in the Caribbean were doing, to think more critically about, well, what is the importance of radio at this time? And what did it mean to actually hear their voices on the airwaves as opposed to just seeing their images, as what happens in this presentation where you just see them? What does it mean to hear? And so research into African women's involvement in radio is growing, though it remains, as Dr. Sarah Akrofi Kwaroko at the University of Ghana argues, quote, overwhelmingly political, institutional, technical, and male-centric, end quote. Rose O'Dampton of the Ghana Broadcasting Network was one of the many Ghanaian women involved in African radio broadcast. She was brought in 1955 for training to host the women's based programs, and she was also a teacher who had been educated partially in Britain, and her fluency in French provided the opportunity to serve as translator. She initially served as fashion and beauty correspondent, but later moved into more political news in the 1960s. So it was not surprising that Moton was keen to interview these women. So Moton's interest in Africa was also deeply invested in, moving on, also invested in art and adornment long before the Afrocentric aesthetics of the 1960s. And her prominent visits in the 1940s through the 1950s led in her deciding to partner with two of her friends to form the Afro Arts Bazaar. And this was placed in New York, not only just to sell arts and crafts from Africa, but also to serve as an art gallery for African artists and artists across the African diaspora. And so by 1950, the Afro Arts Bazaar had become, quote, the first commercial outlet for documented African art and folk craft. And they solicited original art from African and African diasporic artists. And the shop also worked to legitimize African artists in this period, which was not seen in the mainstream art world. And even though the Afro Arts Bazaar closed in 1953, and the Moton's interest in adornment also connected her to African women, so that when she talked about how they transmitted performance and culture and expression as a political project, particularly in Ghana, she was saying, this is not something that we should ignore. This is also deeply interesting and an important part of Pan-African politics and Black internationalism. A lot of the costumes or the fashion from the Ghanaian independence celebrations, which blended kente cloth with then contemporary fashions, which was a bold choice to say, we are modern, but we are Black modern, and this is African modernity. And so when Moton detailed these independence movements across the African diaspora and the continent in the 1950s and the 60s, she was also very much interested in the contradictions of movement between these Black nations in the era of Jim Crow and decolonization, such as when she also traveled to Haiti to interview the former First Lady of Haiti, Madame Estime, as well as African-American dancer Lavinia Williams, who was also a Captain Denham troop member who had been hired by the Haitian state to form dance schools. And so another part of my research that I'm delving more deeply into is the use of Caribbean nations bringing in these Black women dancers to create these official state schools of dance, and thinking about the ways that art and expression has then become very vital and deeply important to independence movements and nations in the African diaspora, staking a claim to their culture and their identity and their heritage through art and expressive cultures using women. And so even though at this time, Haiti in particular was on a very shaky ground. This was before Duvalier became the dictator, and this was after the US occupation of Haiti. So she asked Madame Estime, like, are you a feminist? What is the role of women in politics? Because she was very deeply invested in saying, look at what's happening in these other nations. Look at what Black women are doing in other countries. We need to think more critically about the US imperial project if we are this deeply invested in civil rights in the United States. And so even though I have no idea when exactly, I remember when ended, that's why I said circa 1967, midway through 1967, she remained committed to Black radio as well as to Black television in the 1960s and the 1970s that focused on African American and African news. And so the most lasting impression of I Remember When is remarkable when examining not only Moten's use of the program to restore her own life story to the historical record, but that of Black women who might otherwise remain footnotes in the lives of their husbands or other better known stories if they were mentioned at all. And this is Etta Moten Barnette in front of her home in Chicago, still standing. It's no longer owned by the family. And so when she, later on after her husband died in 1967, which is probably also why the radio program ended, she shifted more towards international politics, and she continued to be a hybrid US cultural ambassador, goodwill ambassador, while also working under the internationalist arms of Black women organizations like the African American Institute and the aforementioned Alpha Kappa Alpha, as well as the National Council of Negro Women. And so in 1964, she was appointed special ambassador to the independence celebrations of Zambia, which is the former Northern Rhodesia. In a talk she gave upon return, the continued geographic proximity of racialized violence to the emerging nations on the continent were never far away, as she described a bus trip to Victoria Falls at the borderlands of Zambia and Southern Rhodesia, later Zimbabwe. All was well until they had to pass through a checkpoint for Southern Rhodesia. Etimoton Barnette describes this as the Rhodesian government officials refused to recognize Zambia's government list, which described the 50 people aboard the bus as honored guests and state delegates to the celebration who wanted to see the Victoria Falls from the Rhodesian side. An attendant came to the open bus door and shouted, "Blacks all out, not the others, to show your passports." That meant people from Kenya, Sierra Leone, Trinidad and Tobago, Liberia, the Chief Justice in Nigeria. The voice which answered was the quiet, flat voice of Israel's Foreign Minister, Mrs. Golda Meir. "Is that as your order? We will all get out." All the people, British, Australian, Indian, Asian, rose as one and filed out of the bus. The Southern Rhodesia officials were overwhelmed. The little customs office was about the size of the Greenwood, Mississippi Railway station and gave you the same feeling, so you don't go in. I was quoted in the newspaper as saying, "We don't want to cross your border, and I certainly don't want your stamp on my passport," end quote. So when her activism transformed to these international spheres, and she also traveled alone as well as with other African American and Caribbean activists who were also deeply invested in moving between these international spaces. She also continued to center what she calls woman wisdom, declaring, quote, "Most of my life has been taken up with learning and passing on what I could, learning from my mother when I was old enough to understand just how much she had to give me," end quote. And this philosophy carried into Moten's involvement with the feminist movements in the 1970s and 1980s, where she sympathized with bra burning and despised how feminism was viewed as man-hating. And she delivered many reports at the UN conferences in Mexico City, Copenhagen, and Nairobi to trace her own growing feminist sensibilities about birth control, prostitution, domestic abuse, healthcare, divorce, and third world women of color feminism. And this was when she was in her 70s and 80s at this period. So as you can see, over the course of her long life, she was constantly contending and shaping and being molded by her interactions with women in the African diaspora to realize that there was more to Black feminism, so to speak, particularly before the movement crystallized, as more than just about concerns with the United States and the national project. So throughout the course of her long life, Moten Barnette harness the power of celebrity for this Pan-African activism, for this feminist activism, to center the lives of women in Africa and the African diaspora. She also centered the different roots of intellectual history that occurred outside of the traditional networks of activism, such as cultural displays of power and identity through adornment, art, and more. The relative obscurity of her radio program, I Remember When, thus demands a closer look at the sites where Pan-Africanism and Black feminist activism has been erased from the larger narratives of social movements. And furthermore, radio's ephemeral nature makes it all the more important to think critically about archival evidence of the presence of African American and African diasporic women and their activities. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. Now we will hear from our respondent, Uhuru.
Good afternoon, everyone. I believe it is good morning to others, colleagues in the US. Thank you so much for inviting me to this wonderful conversation. I want to, of course, first of all, thank Angela for this wonderful presentation and your ongoing research, Angela, on the long history of Black women performers in Black activism, which for me is a truly welcomed and valuable addition to the gendered nature of Pan-Africanism and Black internationalism. I really enjoy how you spoke about the civil rights struggle as not only political, but also cultural, and factoring in notions of sisterhood, of arts and culture, of song, of performance, the place of radio in it, the culture of celebrity, adornments, dress code. And I very much would like to hear more about this idea of women's wisdom. I was enriched by listening to your presentation, so thank you. I also enjoyed the visual materials. You don't seem to have any problems, the same problems we have with the archive when looking at work from this era. So it was very, very vitalizing to see some of the visual materials that you have. I enjoyed that very much. So I'm going to be responding to some of the issues raised in the paper. And towards the end, I will be thinking through some of these issues in the framework of Ubuntu, which I noticed you didn't cover in your presentation, but you did in your abstract. So I will also be drawing from the abstract of your presentation to talk about Ubuntu. So I really thought the paper is wonderful and really should be in conversation with the scholar Tsitsi Jaji and her formulation of the stereo modern. She offers this heuristic of the stereo modern as a way to analyze texts and cultural practices that are both political and expressive, particularly activated by Black music and operative within the logic of Pan-Africanism. And I think that the radio fits in very well there, the stereo and the audio and the sonic as an expressive within the larger Black world of Pan-Africanism. I thought that stereo modernism is very useful, and I will return to this when I get to the Ubuntu discussion. Ghana is one of the countries that she focuses on in her book. Her book is called Africa in Stereo. And I think that your work builds really, really wonderfully on this notion of the sonic, particularly the exploration of radio as a sonic technology whose knowledge of how and where it is heard is beyond traceability or quantification. So I thought your work builds wonderfully on Tsitsi Jaji's work. I also thought closer attention to cultural and performative connections are very important to complicate the research on Cold War era secretaries of exchange that are often limited to political science or international relations, and that your work really importantly and crucially moves beyond foreign policy and even political struggle as a single defining characteristic. So yes, that for me was something that is quite salient, that we can bring these and must bring the cultural and the performative to these discussions around Cold War secretaries. And I appreciate how also this intervention that I've just mentioned from your work challenges the sharp delineations, as you mentioned, between African American history and African history. This is very important because the separation of these two has created some kind of bifurcation between diaspora and Africa, has created a sense of Africa's relationship with its diaspora, especially diaspora in the North, that has located Africa as recipient or as emulating African American culture and history. So it is important that these delineations be challenged, and that we show continuity, as you do in your work, between Africa and its diaspora. I wondered if you have thought of these delineations and their roots really explicitly rooted in the Cold War politics, particularly in the infiltration of the university by the CIA in the 1950s, who decisively formed area studies, the discipline, as a way to focus research on particular regions of interest, right? This is all detailed in Bhakti Shingapure's really wonderful book. I think it came out in 2019, called Cold War Assemblages. It's got many other more delicious goodies in relation to these kinds of Cold War era secretaries, travel, exchanges, solidarities, and so forth. I was really enriched by your discussion of theories on Black performance, and I really, of course, for selfish reason, single this out because it is related to my own research. I truly believe that, like Fred Moten argues. Speaking of Fred Moten, I wonder if there's any relation between Etta Moten and Fred Moten. But anyway, so Moten argues that the history of Blackness is in Black performance, that you're likely to find it in performativity than perhaps in books, for instance, and that notion of the sonic always comes back as a way to trace and map Black history. But yeah, I was enriched by this discussion on performance that attend to the labor of the senses. Ooh, I love that. The senses, the emphasis on the body, on ritual, on movement in the historiography of Black internationalism. I really think this is a major intervention of your work that kind of puts or gives political currency to senses, bodily senses, bodily knowledges, rituals, movements, and so forth. So I really appreciated that. And of course, hearing more about the radio program, I Remember When by Etta Burnett, just kind of got me all types of excited. This idea of, as she says, quote, sounding the voices of so-called illiterate market women, close quotes, was so generative for me. And I stayed with the possibilities that these voices of illiterate market women, so-called, right? How those voices can be used, or rather already exceed the limits of literacy and access to education, and the production of print culture and publications, which so far in our work in Black Studies, print cultures have become and continue to be durable vehicles of studying political and cultural Pan-Africanism through a plethora of small magazines from Black Paris, from Black London, New York, Chicago, Uganda, Nigeria, South Africa. So these small magazines and newspapers and other forms of periodicals have really, been centered in the study of these political and cultural Pan-Africanisms, their expression and their record. But you're bringing in the voices of the so-called illiterate market women is a welcome challenge and disruption of this largely masculinist world of periodicals and of print cultures, by using voice and performance, which, as I already said, is a major intervention. And I wonder how, how these have shaped a type of gendered internationalism, where how it can at least reconfigure this internationalism, where the voices of Black women are minimal and of African women almost absent. They're just almost not there. So my interest is piqued by the platform of the radio that offers other forms of knowing and being that are not narrowed down by writing. What else exists outside of what other modes of knowing and being exists outside of the epistemology, the epistle, the epistolary, the writing. So what exists in other forms of orality and so forth. And of course, also these print cultures are also often in the so-called colonial languages, English, French, Portuguese, etc. And I wonder, and this is a question to you, I'd like to hear more about the nature of these market women's voices. How were these broadcasted? Did they speak in a Ghanaian language and have it translated, or did Etta Moten translate them and kind of speak on their behalf? I'm interested in that, and how what they can reveal, these voices, about this polyglotic internationalism and translation that Brent Hayes Edwards writes about. So the possibility of Black women in Chicago in the 1950s listening to voices of African women on radio is truly an exciting one, an exciting prospect. I want to hear more about these voices, because we can also think about how they shape affect. So what would it mean for Black women or African American women in Chicago or in the US, for them to hear African women speaking in African languages in the mid-50s on the radio, this must have been a transformative experience, because of course we know that the 60s and 70s, we have the rise of Black Power movement. Black is beautiful, the changing of people's names, the Amiri Barakas, and then Dozake Shange, and so forth. So this exposure to African languages on radio in the previous decade is very productive, and can be seen as being in continuity with the following decades. So Moten's, Etta Moten's Bridging of Africa and its diaspora through song and art and dance is so vital. So vital, because these are the touchstones of African social life, right? And actually, song, art, and dance are where philosophical performances of Ubuntu are articulated. Ubuntu is expressed through the rituals and ceremony that reinstate or articulate notions of interdependence, interconnectedness, and interrelationality. So I find that those particular modalities are so important in thinking through Pan-African relations. And this is where I think ritual, the labor of the senses and the body, are central to using activist and artistic philosophies of women to move past the limitations of traditional academy. Which I see your work as doing. I observe here the Eurocentric nature of the university, whose genealogy and orientation to knowledge undervalues these faculties of being and knowing, such as song, art, dance, ritual, senses, and the body. These are undervalued by the academy, but also by Euro-patriarchy. And some forms of African and Black patriarchy. So these are not seen as forms of knowledge. Academia is also in many ways diametrically opposed to the tenets of Ubuntu in its way of doing things, and in its way it structures, for instance, disciplinary formations within the university. Let's just say in the humanities alone, the separation of literature from performance, from music, from history, from psychology, from drama, and visual arts is a false one, so there's a sense that academia stands opposed to the tenets of Ubuntu, of interconnectedness, of interdependence, and interrelationality, and hence it is well advised to push beyond academic frameworks to study and hear women's activism and artistic philosophies. So the more we stick to these pigeonholes of disciplines in academia, and the more we adhere to what academia deems knowledge, the less of the community is sounded, the less women's voices are sounded, the less of ritual and ceremony and philosophies of being like Ubuntu are sounded. So I use the word hear and not read or see. Reading and seeing is such a domain of academic knowledge production. I use hearing women's activism and hearing their artistic philosophy, because the world as organized in the Ubuntu principle is not anthropomorphic. It's not human-centered. It rests upon the world being one interlinked ecosystem where all is pervaded by a life force with its own form of life. So Ubuntu makes space for knowing the world beyond the province of the eye, so beyond the province of books, of the epistle, of epistemology. It makes space for knowing other worlds, the metaphysical, the unseen, the unknown and unknowable, and creates the space of coming into proximity with one another through embodied kind of senses like intuition and interiority, affect, not only reason and differentiation. How am I doing with time? I feel like I'm gone with.
That's great. That's just wonderful. Some amazing comments here and very engaging. We're waiting for some questions at the moment. Angela, would you like to respond to any of the comments that Uhuru has put out for us today?
I would. I was particularly struck by you're mentioning, like, did they hear the women speaking African languages? And yes, they did. There were many moments where they were speaking their language and it was translated, and Etimoton Barnette was like, oh, this is what was said. And there was just this constant conversation and no pause between, oh, well, I can only speak with people who speak English. Like, so I thought that was extraordinary. And you're mentioning that, I was like, oh, I forgot to mention that was what was actually being recorded when I was taking my transcriptions, because like when I was creating this this paper, I was looking at my transcriptions as opposed to remembering what I was hearing when I was taking these transcriptions. So I do think that it is very extraordinary. Like, this was happening in the 1950s, long before the Black is Beautiful and the Afrocentric movement, where people were changing their names, like you said. And I was also just like, yes, 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 thinking about like just Ubuntu and performance, and thinking about these disciplinary boundaries between what is knowledge. I mean, I would say that the academy, I agree with you about the academy, because it's created to put you into these disciplinary boundaries. So when you are, as myself, attempting to bridge a bunch of disciplines and to think more critically about what knowledge is and what knowledge looks like, or what knowledge sounds like, it's like, well, you're not going to get an academic job if you do that, because no one else is going to understand what you're talking about. But again, I'm a lot more interested in like, well, what was their actual experience? What was their lived experience? And that does dovetail into, as you said, the creation of area studies and the splitting of African studies from African American studies and African Americans from Africa, which is something that I'm also deeply interested in, particularly thinking about HBCUs as these incubators of diasporic belonging and creation of knowledge. And then when area studies emerged and Cold War exigencies meant that the government and other foundations decided to fund institutions as opposed to HBCUs, then that meant that these spaces where a lot of people in the diaspora came together and were educated and created their own lineage of knowledge and epistemologies about Africa and the African diaspora. Like, so then that then manifested in African Americans and Africans being separate in outside of the academy. And I think that it's very, it's a detail that we should pay more attention to and be more critical of, particularly when we are entering these spaces of the university and they are attempting to corral us into these disciplinary as well as these nation state borders of knowledge.
We're still waiting on a few questions here. Nothing has come out yet, but I was also thinking of a point that Uhuru was making or kind of alluding to in America and its American process of movement. And so thinking about the Great Migration, especially how it relates to Chicago and how that migration to urban centers to the north and what did that mean for women? You know, their identity and their thought process as far as moving to the urban centers. And really, when you think about the 50s, Great Migration started in 1916. So we're talking about kind of in the midst of this great movement of Africans, and what does that mean for women and their roles, the role that they play in politics and in the home and at work.
Yeah, and I mean, this also happened in the 20th century in South Africa, right? There was also large movements of people from the rural countryside into the city, to work in the gold mines, but also, you know, they were forced into a wage system by the British and the Dutch instituting some kind of poll and hut tax. So there was kind of these large movements of people from the rural to the country to the city, and this creates and this is why I appreciate how you are working with this, Angela. This creates and continues to create this bifurcation between rural and urban, which also is gendered. Rural, the women stated, it kind of, in South Africa, it was explicitly that only men were allowed in the city, only men were given passes to be in the city. So the geography is also so divided. There's like a gendered spatial separation. And there's also the reach and the idealism of the city that has created a disillusionment and disenchantment with rural knowledges, with ideas and philosophies of being and knowing that are indigenous to the people, that that were kind of seen as backwards now that modernity is here. So these are also gendered, and that bring questions of land, for instance, and indigenous medicinal practices, astronomy and astrology, the indigenous ways of understanding that. And that's what I mean by an Ubuntu that is not anthropomorphic. It is actually about the connection with the animal world, with the cosmos, and with the land, and women were kind of, by the mere virtue of having these knowledges bifurcated according to rural and city, women held this knowledge. When you say women's wisdom, I'm like, bing, I'm picked, because I think women hold that knowledge, and now we are seeing a kind of move in politics of solidarity towards decentering the human in discourses of solidarity, and thinking about land, thinking about indigenous people, thinking about knowledges. And these are not coincidentally led by women and queer folk and gender non-conforming folk. So there is something there about gender that has a long arc in history, and to where we are today, and how we think of Black international politics and activism.
We have a question here, and it goes as, how did these women manage to survive when everything was against them?
Depends on what you mean by survive. I think this is also why I'm deeply interested in class, because of the mobility that was offered by being famous and being wealthy, wealthier than an average like African-American person in the 20th century. And why I'm also deeply interested in the fact that Etta Moten Barnette had her radio program, but she also recorded several oral histories over the course of her life in different decades, as well as writing about her career and her life, and before she began truly traveling, and just comparing, like, she's telling these same stories about her life in different decades, and what were the different ways that she was telling the same story, and why did she tell it differently in this different decade, in this different period of her life, and what connections can I make between how she actually felt about a lot of the injustices and the oppression and the racism that she faced over time. Because a lot of the time, if you just think about listening to them at one period of their life, that's not the entire truth. And that's not, that might not be how they actually felt at that time. And when you go back and listen to something that they recorded later on, you're like, okay, then they're giving a little bit more, or maybe they're hiding a little bit more. And they felt more free to talk about something when they were younger than they were when they were older, or vice versa. So I think that that question should be centered more towards, well, what were the techniques and the strategies that they used to deal with their oppressions and then think more critically about what they said about it, and what you hear them saying about these situations, and less about, oh, they feel bad about it. Because Etimoton Barnette, towards the end of her life, she was just like, I don't think about any of the racism at all. But early in the period in her life, when she was talking about when she was, because she traveled a lot to perform, and when she was in Porgy and Bess, and they traveled to Idaho, and she talked about how they were not allowed to stay in the hotels in Idaho. But again, like when she was in her 80s, she's like, I don't think about any of that anymore. I don't want to talk about it. So just think about how people think about their life over time and the ways that they feel free or unfree to talk about certain injustices.
Okay.
I also picked up, sorry to jump in here, but also I picked up from your work, Angela, the importance of, I mean, survival is about creating these enclaves of safety. And in your paper, I picked up that friendship, like underrated stuff, friendship, community, sisterhood, as tools of Black feminism also create spaces of safety and refueling and rejuvenating across borders. I mean, she had connections everywhere in the Black world. And this for me was actually quite important.
Okay, so this is a quite lengthy question, so bear with me. So we have here, my question relates to your very important point about women knowledges, which Professor Phalafala very adaptly echoed in her comments about the effective, artistic, and performative implications of voices of market women. In her positioning as celebrity, cultural ambassador, showcasing the heritage of Africa and African diaspora. Are there specific philosophies rooted in African modes of being and knowing from Brazil, the Caribbean, of the African continent that Moton particularly isolated, foregrounded, or even creatively reconfigured through the pattern of her radio program? That's a lot there.
This is why I thought it was very interesting when she traveled to Latin America and Brazil and Argentina in particular, and was very struck by the similarities in sound, in the music. And she's like, oh, I hear our similar histories in this music, and the fact that, oh, I'm singing Negro spirituals and you're singing what you call in Brazil sorrow songs, and there's this similarity in sound. And so what does that mean? That this is my first time hearing these songs. So what are these cultural remembrances that we are both nations or both peoples in these different nations are bringing together in this period, and not even knowing that they're developing at similar timelines, even though they were emancipated in Brazil far later than in the United States. But everyone is having these similar sounds and feeling these similar feelings about enslavement. And even though I said like Edama Burnett had this very simplistic view of like, oh, they were Brazilians once they were emancipated, like there's still this sense of Black sound that I find very important to how she configured herself as a diasporic citizen, as opposed to just thinking about being African American or being part of the United States and part of the United States Nation project. And I'm still digging more deeply into these different ways of knowing and being, since this is a portion of my dissertation project. But this is a great question to really take back from this talk.
Question for you, Angela, that I think is really interesting. And what would you say is the significance of your study? How is the life of present day Black women celebrities in the US different from Etta Moten's?
It's something I attempted to argue with my advisor, but he told me to take Beyonce out of my dissertation. But I mean, I think there's a lot of similarities. There was recently a PBS documentary called How It Feels to Be Free, looking at a bunch of Black women performers in the 60s and the 70s, dealing with the similar things that Etta Moten Barnette dealt with that Lena Horne dealt with, that, again, going back to the 19th century when Black women used anti-slavery activism, and then later on the anti-lynching activism, and using their celebrity and using their prominence to speak out against injustices. And though if they hadn't spoken out, like Ida B. Wells hadn't spoken out about lynching and written the Red Record, we would have no record of how horrible lynching was. But then they were told, well, you're a woman, you need to sit down. You're not supposed to be as outspoken and as vocal and as visible as you are, even though the work that they did was very important. So then when I'm looking at these performers, and they're doing the same work, but in a more, I guess, a more quote unquote feminine way, in that, well, they look beautiful, so that means they're conforming to these gender expectations and these gender roles. But then, as I argue, like, then that has projected into our future that they were only glamorous and beautiful. They did not have any activist interests, and that they didn't, then that their work wasn't activism, and they were not deeply involved in political movements. And so I think, again, like, Beyonce is the most prominent and visible example of someone that is contested as an activist while also being told, well, whenever something happens, you need to speak up and represent the race because you are famous and important and rich. And so I'm just like, what is that tension that Black women celebrities across history have had to deal with, walking this tightrope of being told, you're frivolous, you're not important, you need to sit down, while also saying, well, we need you to represent the best of us.
I think we have time for perhaps maybe one or two more questions. We have from Eleanor. You mentioned quite a few times the issue of respectability. In which way were her contributions to culture and womanhood impacted by this?
So she married at 17 and had 3 children pretty much back to back. And so she was, and then she got divorced by age of 21. So she was a single mother of 3 daughters by 21 years old. And she talks about how she had moved back with her parents in Kansas City after divorcing her husband. And her neighbor told her, you're still young. Why are you turning into basically an old woman? You are still young and vital and vibrant. What are your dreams? And so she ended up leaving her daughters with her parents. And that's when she returned to college. And she doesn't talk about it a lot. Like, she only mentioned it later on in her life, and when she was recording oral histories when she was in her 80s and 90s. And so when she was at the height of her fame, she didn't talk about leaving her children behind to pursue her career. And I find that to be a moment where you think about, like, what do you have to conceal in order to present a respectable image? And then she had married Claude Barnett about 5 to 6 years after her divorce, and after she, again, like, she started her career. And she told him, I'm not going to marry you if you force me to be a housewife. So they spent the bulk of their career or their marriage apart. They would meet up whenever they decided, oh, we're going to be in this similar town, or I'm coming back to Chicago. And I was reading some of his letters to, like, their wider networks, and he's like, oh, she's in Florida now, or oh, she just flew over to London. So, like, they had a very unconventional marriage. She had a very unconventional life, but these are not things that she spoke about during the height of her career. She only talked about them towards the end of her life. So I would say that's something interesting to think about. She is still presenting this image of respectability when she is at the height of her career, but when you listen to her talk later on in her years, she's like, that wasn't what my life really was. And so you can think more about the ways that other Black women celebrities or other prominent Black women, we assume that they had these respectable lives, but we need to think about what was actually happening underneath. And then that opens the door for thinking about our assumptions about women's history in general. And I mean, I also say that this concept of women's history of moving towards women's suffrage and breaking apart the separate spheres is not Black women's history, it's only white women's history. So when we look at Black women, the lineage of women's history is very different.
And finally, we will end on this last question here. How was Etta Moten perceived by the communities she engaged within the Black world?
This is why I was so disappointed by the pandemic closing down my ability to travel abroad again. Because this has been since her radio program is the linchpin and the central site of analysis that I'm using in my dissertation. It's also been extra work to figure out audience responses to this program, because I can only find responses to it in the Black press, and a lot of them are just, oh, it's going to be broadcast on this day and time, and this is who she's going to be interviewing. So I'm also very curious about how she was perceived on the other end